We are really pleased to be with you all to recognize that we know everyone can't travel to these workshops that we host, but we do want to be able to reach everyone with the insights and the learnings that we're taking away from the conversations. And so that is what today is all about, is to be able to share at a top line level what was discussed and really recognize all of the great insights that our incredible lineup of speakers brought to the table in that conversation. So like I said, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and go through a couple of big picture housekeeping notes. So as you can see, you have been muted upon entry. So appreciate that if you have a question that you want to raise or a comment that you want to add, if you just take yourself off of mute, you can do that. We also, of course, welcome questions and comments in the chat. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, if there's the little chat bubble, if you click on that, it will open up the panel on the right and you can contribute your comments there. Webex has updated, so there are lots of ways to use this now. You can either chat to everyone or you can also send a direct message. If there is something that you would like to contribute confidentially, you can most certainly send that directly to Aguarin Iriarte, and he will make sure that your comment or question is provided on your behalf, and that way that will keep your question confidential. To enhance accessibility, we have captions that have been enabled. So in the bottom left-hand corner of your slide, you see that closed captioning button. You can click that and it will open up that panel for you if that helps your accessibility to today's conversation. And we are going to record today's webcast and go ahead and upload that to our website as a resource as well. So your participation in today's conversation provides your consent to that recording. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into today's conversation. So like I said, it's crazy that it has already been a week since we were together in New York, but this is our opportunity to come together and share some insights with you. Now, a really, really important part of this conversation is that these regional workshops, and I'll share a bit more in a moment about the regional workshops more broadly, but they are done in partnership with the national labs. And so this particular regional workshop in the Northeast was a partnership that we had done with Brookhaven National Lab. So I really want to recognize our partners in that at the lab. And if you move me on to the next slide, Aguarin, we were really lucky when we were opening up to have Martin Schuenen, who is the Associate Lab Director, share a few words of welcome to New York, to share a little bit more about the lab itself, and really to give us a great opening to the day. I know that Martin wanted to share a few words this morning as well. I don't currently see him on the list of attendees. So Martin, I just want to do a quick check and see if you're on the line. So give him a chance to jump in. Martin, are you there? Okay, so without Martin on the line, we're just going to keep moving, but I do want to recognize that that Martin and Dave and Elspeth and Pete and Mike, the whole gang from BNL, were absolutely wonderful in planning this, and we really appreciate everything that they put forward to us. So with that, let me tell you a little bit more about kind of from a big picture standpoint, what these workshops are all about. So when we launched Climate Ready, we launched the Climate Ready Affinity Group, which many of you on the line are a part of. And that's a way that stakeholder organizations can get involved in the conversation around the development of the Climate Ready framework. One of the groups that are a part of that affinity group is, of course, the national labs. And one of the ways that we have really been able to collaborate with the national labs throughout Climate Ready is through our regional workshop series. So you can see that these were kicked off last year in April. We started first in Chicago with Argonne, then we headed west to Seattle with PNNL. The Southeast was this past spring with Oak Ridge, and now we were finally wrapping up in Brookhaven with Brookhaven in New York. And so it was a great opportunity to do a couple of things. These regional workshops were intended to first really focus in on the topics that are regionally specific. And I said this during my welcome in New York, we recognize that the impacts of climate change can be hyperlocal. And so we really want to make sure that we are enabling those regional conversations. And so for each of these workshops, we pick 2 hazards, one that the region knows well and we can gain some lessons learned, and one that may be more of an emerging issue, either because it's a complicated hazard to address or because it is becoming more frequent or intense in that region. So that first goal of these workshops is really to dig into the regional considerations. So we really want to make sure that we are thinking about the hazard itself first. What is the science telling us about that hazard today? What does the science tell us about the way that hazard might change over time? And then use that as a really strong foundation to then move into a conversation about what that might mean in terms of impact to the power system. So really important for us to start with the science first. The third piece of this is about bridging the gap between the scientific community and the power system practitioners. So we've been really thoughtful about these workshops being a space of networking, conversation, building relationships, so that we have a community of folks, both from the science and the power system standpoint, that can continue to walk down these really complicated questions. Because as we've said many times, the Climate Ready framework will publish next spring, but the work is definitely not done. In fact, I might even suggest there is much, much more work to be done once the framework is actually published. And so this is a way that we can continue to build that community and bridge that gap. So I am really pleased that I think we achieved all of those things when we were together at the very cool TWA Hotel in Queens, right there at JFK Airport. So Agwarn, if you'll move me to the last slide, just a couple of big picture highlights around the workshop itself, and then we'll dig into the sessions themselves, right? So already mentioned it was last week. I really want to thank our Workstream 1 folks. So those that are close to Climate Ready know Workstream 1 is all about physical climate data and guidance. They hosted a 101 training using our Climate 101 modules 4 through 6 the half day before. I was so bummed to not make it, but I heard some great conversation was had there. So I want to thank that team and those that attended to be a part of that. We had a great turnout, almost 100 folks in the room, and I really want to thank all of our speakers. I do see some of our speakers on the line today, which is fantastic. It was a great way to learn from others, and I invite those that are on the line that were speakers to jump in at any time to add commentary and perspective on the day. We will now walk through at a very high level that agenda. And what we've done here in terms of the structure of this webcast is I've asked for members of the Climate Ready team who were there at the workshop to pull together some of the key insights that they took from each of our speakers. We don't want to burden our speakers anymore and make them represent. So I think it's really interesting to hear from a Climate Ready team standpoint, what were some of those primary insights and takeaways that they heard, share those with you. And then, like I said, for any speakers that are on the line that want to kind of add in the chat anything they want to share based on what they presented or answer any of your questions in the chat, we certainly welcome that as well. So I think with that, what I want to do is go ahead and start these session overviews. So the first one is Delavane, and she'll explain where we started with the science. And then we will just keep passing through and give you an idea of how the day went. So Delavane, without further ado, I will pass it to you. Delavane, you might be muted if you're chatting. I know we did a sound check.
How about now?
That's perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I'll kick off this technical recap with our phenomenal speaker on flooding science. This is Dr. Bernice Rosenweig. She holds an endowed professor appointment in environmental studies at Sarah Lawrence College. It was really cool to have Bernice at our event because she came to us literally days after wrapping up a major comprehensive scientific assessment on climate change and flood risk as part of the New York City Panel on Climate Change. That's NPCC. If you know the IPCC, this is a local version of that. If you're interested in her chapter, you can Google NPCC 4 flood risk, and it will come up. So Bernice covered 4 types of flooding in her talk. And Aguaran, if you'll move me to the next slide, I just want to use that to give an orientation to those 4 types of flooding. So here we have on the top left, coastal flooding. So this occurs due to high tides and or often with storm. And so that can be accompanied by tropical cyclones or extratropical cyclones. The major factors that influence this type of coastal flooding can be factors like wind and pressure-driven storm surge on top of, kind of the natural variation with a high tide that will vary over the course of the day and the month and the seasons, and then also the amplification of storm surges that can blow water onto the coastline. And so that's what you see depicted in the top left. Then in the top right is fluvial flooding. So that's kind of a tongue twister. Fluvial flooding occurs when a river or some other where the water exceeds the elevation of its banks, so flowing. And this is also referred to sometimes as riverine flooding. Then in the bottom left, we have fluvial flooding. This is also a bit of a tongue twister. This one starts with a P, and this occurs when the intensity or the rate of precipitation exceeds the capacity of the land surface to infiltrate it, so to take it up into the ground, or when the rate of precipitation and leftover runoff exceeds the capacities of either natural or engineered drainage systems to deal with that water. So this is often referred to as urban flooding. In Harvey in Houston, because developed cities like that have a really high percentage of buildings, pavements, and other impervious surfaces that really prevent what would otherwise be natural infiltration into the ground. And then in the bottom right, we have groundwater flooding. And this occurs when the water table, and that's the level at which underground surface is saturated with water, if that becomes higher than the land surface or some kind of infrastructure. And so that results in groundwater flowing into those spaces. So I think that these graphical depictions really help. The last 2 points I want to make is that these different types of flooding can occur in conjunction with each other, and that's known as compound flooding. And I wanted to make a connection to a relatively new, recently published READi deliverable from from Workstream 1. And this is a white paper that really explains how to think about and characterize and even quantitatively analyze compound hazards. Maybe I made that sound like it's a little too straightforward. It's still very complex, but it to think about the risk of compound hazards, and that's available on the EPRI and Climate READi website. So Goran, if you take me back, I'll just kind of quickly highlight a few other points that Bernice made about these 4 types of flooding. So in terms of coastal flooding, obviously sea level rise is a major factor here. We have what is known to in kind of the scientific community as a commitment to sea level rise. So because of warming that has already taken place in the atmosphere that will find its way into the oceans as it kind of there's thermal equilibrium, and there's lags in these systems in terms of ocean water turning over. Thermal expansion will continue to play out. So even if we stop emitting emissions today, we would be locked into 0.5 meter of sea level rise. Sorry, let me try to switch my phone. I just saw a message that it's hard to hear me. So hopefully this is a little better. So sea level rise, we're already locked into a little bit. And in addition, depending on what warming trajectory we're on, and Bernice presented several different scenarios, sea level rise in the New York area up to 1.5 meters is possible. But this can still be avoided by moving from some of the higher warming scenarios down to the lower warming scenarios with rapid greenhouse gas reductions. Sea level rise of over 2 meters is still possible under those high emission scenarios. And she spoke about a particular worst case scenario. And if you were at the workshop, you may have missed what she was into her slide scenario. And that stands for Antarctic rapid ice melt. So if you're wondering what that ARIM scenario was, this is kind of a worst case, but still physically plausible scenario that's associated with kind of rapidly melting ice that is currently on land on the continent of Antarctica, particularly the West Antarctic ice sheet. And that could lead to up to 3 meters of sea level rise by 2100 in the New York area. And because this cannot entirely be ruled out, even though it's a very low likelihood, she really emphasized the fact that some decision makers may continue to choose or plan for this in the case of certain high risk, long life infrastructure. I'll try to move really quickly now. So the fluvial flooding, again, this is overflowing rivers. This is directly monitored using stream gauges, and those records can be useful for understanding how this may vary over time. She did make the point that climate change is projected to increase fluvial flooding because of its effect on the frequency and magnitude of intense precipitation. Coming back to the third type of flooding, fluvial flooding, this is the urban flooding. One interesting point she made is that because fluvial flooding is not associated with a single water body, it's actually not considered in any of the FEMA flood maps. And she did make the point that climate change is also expected to increase the occurrence of fluvial flooding because of projections that show that extreme precipitation, such as even the 1 in 10 year return level, is being projected to increase by about 25% in many cities in the
I think we may have officially lost Delavine this time. We got close several times. So thank you. I'll keep us moving. Delavine gave us like this great overview, and Bernice was incredible. She was a really great speaker, and we learned a lot in terms of flooding. I saw people taking furious notes as we were sitting there in the room, and it set a really good foundation for a conversation around the impacts. So Jonathan, why don't we go ahead and let you jump in here and share some of the insights that you gleaned from the actual panel that I moderated on flooding impacts to infrastructure.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Delavine. So yeah, the next talk was an flooding impacts panel moderated by Morgan, and it had 3 other participants in it. Mike Ragona, who is the chief engineer of substation projects engineering with Con Ed. Eric Wilson, who was the VP of Climate Resilience and Sustainability Planning at MTA, and Ed Kearns, who's the Chief Data Officer at First Street Foundation. Because of the structure of the talk, there's a number of key takeaways. I don't think there was any particular one that stood out more than the other, so I'll just kind of list a few of them that I found kind of relevant. The first is that major climate events, in this case Hurricane Sandy, can drive resilience and adaptation efforts. So in the cases of Con Ed and MTA, the Hurricane Sandy really drove these efforts to harden their infrastructure and develop these climate vulnerability and climate resilience plans. And so that's something I think that we can take away in the future as these sorts of major climate events keep happening. One thing that came up in several different aspects was challenges to communication. So Ed Kearns at First Street Foundation spoke about the limits of the FEMA flood zones. I think Delavane touched on that a little bit with pluvial flooding. Another thing that came up was the time scale of scenarios. I think that was Mike who mentioned that, kind of communicating how things in the next 30 years are going to change kind of regardless. And then from there, that's really when you see that emission scenario divergence. Another thing was data underlying risk assessment. So making sure that methodology and data is clear, and that kind of connects to a Q&A question from Delavane that I'll bring up in a bit. In terms of data needs, again, Delavane touched on this, but there's a lot of interest from the companies on pluvial flooding, getting more information on pluvial flooding, and relatedly cloudburst events. And then finally, paths from data to action. Okay, we have all this data. How do we move that into action? Well, barring some major climate event that really gets people moving, one good thing to do would be to share data with consumers. So First Street Foundation talked about sharing their information with Redfin, the real estate website, as well as nonprofit researchers. The other thing I'll point out is kind of two questions from the audience that they thought were pretty interesting. One question was related to asking the companies how they think about adaptation and whether they want to prioritize current versus future infrastructure. Eric at MTA made a comment that, they're customer centric and they want to deliver services where the customer is. And so obviously that means current infrastructure, although when they plan for future infrastructure, obviously some of the adaptation is important there as well. Con Ed also made an interesting point that, adaptation is definitely something that they're working on, but that's something they've always worked on, is trying to improve their operations. There's a lot more concern over reducing their carbon emissions. And then the last thing was a great question that was brought up on proprietary data and methods. So First Street Foundation is a proprietary data set. Questions about, for something that, should it be a public good, or what's the rationale for having a privatized product? And Ed's answer was basically that there's no free lunch, either customers paying for it or taxpayers paying for it. And one way to kind of get around the limits of this is to do a lot of public dissemination of the results. And then Morgan, if you'll advance to or Goran, if you'll advance to the next slide. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So I just gave you 1,000 words. Here's a picture to kind of summarize it. Here's a flooding at a subway station, South Ferry, in October 2012 was Hurricane Sandy. And you can just kind of see, how much of a big deal that a major climate event can be. All right. With that, I will pass it on to Anna.
Trying to get my video on as well. Hi, everyone. So we closed off that morning with an update from the Department of Energy, hearing from David Parsons, who's at the Grid Deployment Office. That was a great opportunity because the Grid Deployment Office is a relatively newer office of the Department of Energy, very impactful. And he explained a little bit about it. And really, importantly, is one of the goals. It has 3 goals, but a core one is to prevent outages and enhance the resilience of the electric grid. So really relates to the work that we do in Climate Ready. And they use a tool, and I'm sure most people have heard about it, is the GRIP program. And the reason that people have heard about it is it's got $10.5 billion in grants that are focused on enhancing grid flexibility and resilience. Huge impact that it can have with that type of funding. And 2 topics are really impactful on the resilience side. The first round of funding on GRIP 1, I wrote this down, just an incredible stat, that the first round of funding is the single largest direct investment in critical grid infrastructure in US history. And so it gives you this flashback of time of, post-World War II redevelopment of the US at that time, and you think of the same thing kind of happening today. And this climate focus that's involved in it is so impactful. They also let us know about GRIP 2 funding. So, 8 projects already announced, but there's actually more to come. There's rumors of things to come even next week. So lots happening in this space. If we talk about the next slide, they told us a little bit more about the Grid Resilience Technical Assistance Program. And so this is another one, not just of funding, but helping companies, especially focused on your municipal, co-op, indigenous communities, like so tribes, and providing that support. And they've got these consortiums and they've done some work here to help these organizations do risk assessment, vulnerability assessments, do some training, really focused on making sure that there's data sharing, there's building capacity. So it is a resource that is available to those of us working in this space. So that was the announcement, and with I'll give it to Jacob to talk about the next part of the afternoon.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, we kicked off the afternoon with a hydropower case study that was supported by Climate Ready. And so this was a joint presentation between NIPA and EPRI. And so first we had Maureen Golan, who's the program manager of the climate resilience area at NIPA, provide some perspective around the stakeholders at NIPA. So that includes government, municipalities, and businesses, before she got into their climate strategy, which is formed both internally and by New York State mandates. I want to note that Maureen really emphasized a new authority granted to NIPA by the state to develop, own, and operate new additional renewable projects. And then finally, she touched on the different areas of their climate resilience strategy. So that includes adapting to physical, operational, and transitional risks and opportunities. And then we had Getnat Malui from NIPA as well, who's a senior hydrologist there. And he provided some perspective around their Jarvis Power project. This is a small hydropower dam with about 9 megawatts capacity in upstate New York. He provided some hydrological context, but most importantly, talked about how the reservoir is operated, which is really, there's a few different priorities. The first being to provide water for navigation to the New York Canal system. 2, this reservoir is the sole source of drinking water for the greater Utica area, which is about 130,000 people, right? And then as sort of some tertiary benefits, it of course generates electricity and supports aquatic ecosystems and so on. And so this really teed me up to come on stage and talk about this EPRI-NIPA collaboration where we did a hydropower climate vulnerability assessment of the Jarvis Power facility. And so, in short, we were able to analyze both historic and projected inflow data for the Jarvis Reservoir to understand how the total inflows might change, as well as sort of droughts and peak inflows. And even more importantly, a reservoir operations model was created to understand how these changing inflows could alter the operation of the reservoir in the future. And so that would include impacts such as changing electrical generation, the amount of water that's being spilled, and the ability to continue providing these services, right? Providing water for navigation and drinking water to Utica. And finally, we closed off by presenting a national hydropower screening assessment, a process that was developed by EPRI, where we analyzed about 1,200 dams across the United States, across CONUS, to understand, projected climate change impacts on these 1,200 dams and the various purposes that they're designed for, right? So we know there's generation, there's flood mitigation, irrigation, and all of these different purposes that we've identified. And so for each of these, we've developed an indicator. And given the theme of this workshop was flooding, we presented the results for our flooding risk indicator. So if you could go to the next slide. We shared this map, which shows the change in flood risk between the historical period and this future period from 2020 to 2059 under a sort of moderate greenhouse gas emissions scenario. And so, just to walk you through some of the results here, we see that the darker blues here are showing areas with a higher average flood risk for dams in that area. Each region has this associated pie chart, right, where the size of the pie chart is the hydropower capacity, and the colors in the pie chart there are really showing the number of dams or the proportion of dams in that region associated with each flood risk category. And so some key takeaways here we see are that, of course, there's a lot of variability across the country in terms of flood risk. We see, in particular, some areas like the Great Basin, like Ohio and the South Atlantic Gulf region, where in these dark blue, where we see this increase in the potential for flooding. And a lot of that is driven by, increases in extreme precipitation, which we see in our climate models, particularly in, Kentucky, West Virginia, Florida, and some other areas across the country. And so, yeah, this metric really measures the change in peak inflows and the ability of the dams to sort of manage those inflows via discharge. And so before I close off, I just want to point out that, this is sort of not a comprehensive risk indicator. It's really developed as a screening tool to identify where more targeted assessments are needed in the future. And so with that, I'll pass it to Jeff.
All right, thanks, Jacob. So I just want to quickly highlight a great presentation that Erin Patrick from PPL gave. Erin is the Director of Research and Development there. PPL, if you don't know, covers several different areas from Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island, incorporating several different companies. So PPL really, as a corporation, really sees climate resilience as a key topic that they need to focus on. And like many of you, are committed to net zero by 2050. Erin showed a great slide demonstrating that in the PPL service territories, carbon dioxide emissions have dropped even below the old Obama era Clean Power Plan threshold. So definitely making good progress in that plan, in that goal. And then Erin also pointed out that their company and others, of course, are seeing these shifting load profiles due to this geographically and temporally and seasonally variable climate change that is real and is happening. They are, exploring all these unique approaches to communicating the reality of climate change, because, as a Kentuckian, I can say that we are a conservative state here, and there is that need to really demonstrate, look, climate change is real. Here's how it's happening. Erin showed some great demonstrations of different ways that you can see that climate change is occurring and affecting you on a daily basis, right? The common folk. So as they transition away from coal and natural gas into these cleaner energy technologies, such as solar, it just becomes more and more evident the need for increased, accurate, detailed climate forecast, climate projecting, and weather forecasting to really understand things like cloudy days. So PPL is putting in a lot of solar, and understanding those cloudy days is going to be more and more important. And so Erin showed a great animated slide that we weren't able to show here over the WebEx, but I think you'll have access to it if you download the slide deck. It showed, in real time, a camera shot of one of their solar installations, and you could speed it. It was shown in a sped up form. And so as the cloud cover came in, you could kind of see sparse clouds really didn't do anything. But then once you got a really heavy cloud cover there for a minute, it would drop total production of that solar installation from just about a megawatt down to about half of that. And so really, really can impact power production from these solar installations. And so it's important to really get a handle on projecting cloud cover in the future, which can be very difficult, right? I think you'll hear from one of these next presentations on the difficulty there and the challenges. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dan Kirk-Davidoff.
Thanks, Jeff. So I got the lucky job of summarizing Michael Jensen's talk about cloud science and climate change. Cloud physics is my first scientific love, and it's great. It was great to see a really engaging and interesting talk about how important it is for a lot of our concerns. So, when we first look at clouds and think about them as part of the climate system, maybe we think most of rain, hail, and snow, the things that come out of clouds. But of course, clouds in their capacity to release the latent heat of condensation of water are also really important for the thermodynamics of the atmosphere and can drive stormy winds that we often see with cloud systems. And in addition, they interact really strongly with the radiation that's emitted by the planet and is on its way into space, but also with the radiation that comes from the sun. And they tend to reflect away quite a bit of that, which helps keep the Earth cooler than it would be otherwise. But on the other hand, they absorb a lot of infrared radiation coming up from the planet and re-emit it downwards, and in that way can keep it warmer than it would be otherwise. So depending on the elevation of clouds and their microphysical characteristics and their location and their elevation, they perform a range of radiative roles within the climate system. And so for all of these reasons, they're really important to understand. But because of their multi-scale nature, because clouds exist, when we look at a cloud, it might be, a big thunderstorm cloud might be 10 or 12 kilometers across, but the little eddies that make up the cloud might be a kilometer, and the edges of those eddies that also have their own kind of whirling structure to them might be tens of meters. And so to fully model all the things that are going on within a cloud, and then you get down to the microphysics, the individual ice crystals that might be a fraction of a millimeter at the smallest end. You need to do that comprehensively would require way more computational power than anyone has now or will have in the near future. So there's an awful lot of parameterization involved in cloud modeling. One has to get a sense through statistical analysis of observations of what the clouds are doing in a given cloud setup. So if you have a certain temperature distribution in the atmosphere and you have a certain amount of water vapor, you can bin the atmosphere into different classes of temperature, of rate of temperature change with height, of water vapor. You can bin those clouds into all these different classes and then see what they do in each of those situations. And that's a lot of what we do when we add clouds into the climate models. And the result, because that's, there's some statistical error involved in that, because we can't explicitly model every single bit of what every single cloud is doing, a lot of the uncertainty that remains in our forecasts of climate going forward comes from our still imperfect knowledge of how clouds function within the atmosphere and within the climate system. Next slide. So as an example of that, Michael's presentations, which were actually presented by his boss, Martin, at Brookhaven National Lab, is an example of this kind of range of this high level of complexity in cloud modeling. You can see that if you model precipitation in a numerical weather prediction model, but use a range of different parameterizations of how clouds function, and in particular how the tiny aerosols in the atmosphere that form the nuclei of the ice crystals that later precipitate. Depending on exactly what choices you make in modeling those things, you get really, really different consequences for how much of the water that initially rises up into a cloud winds up precipitating down out of the cloud. Now, you might think this would be an obvious question because once the water condenses in the cloud, you might think, well, it's condensed and now it's going to fall out as rain. So how can all these microphysical choices really matter very much? But the answer is that the cloud can do two things. It can either take the water that rises up from the boundary layer and dump it back down as precipitation of one form or another, snow or rain or hail or whatever, or it can mix that water vapor out of its sides and into the rest of the atmosphere. And depending on the type of aerosols that are present in the atmosphere, it could do either of those things, and it will do either of those things. It's not only a question of uncertainty of knowledge of how these things work, there's also a great deal of uncertainty about what is actually in the atmosphere. And depending on what kind and what number of aerosols are present, the clouds will function differently. And as we change the levels of pollution in the atmosphere, the clouds are performing differently. So they have different radiative impacts depending on whether there are more or fewer human produced aerosols in the atmosphere, and they may have different precipitation patterns as well. So this was a really fascinating talk, a great primer on what's been going on recently in cloud science research, and it was really terrific to see. So thanks very much for your attention, and I will pass it on to Alex.
Hey, thanks, Dan. So my name's Alex Summy. I serve as our Director of Electrification Customer Solutions here at EPRI, and we rounded out the afternoon with a load forecasting panel. I was remiss. I was so focused on getting all kinds of good nuggets on this slide that I forgot to put the most important name, which was Andrea Stade, who is our co-lead of Workstream 3 and very eloquently moderated this panel. On the panel, we had two very fine gentlemen. We had Professor Jorge Gonzalez Cruz, a professor at the University of Albany and joint appointee at Brookhaven. And then we had Brian Ergang, who is the electric load forecasting manager at Long Island Power Authority. So just a quick brief recap, some of the things they shared that really stuck out to me and I thought were insightful. Starting with Jorge first, he started off talking about how important cities are to the big picture. They can represent 70 to 80% of the energy demand, while obviously being a very large contributor of emissions to the overall profile. And on top of that, they are so large and they take up so much space that they do have a two-way feedback between the built environment versus the natural environment. So how one behaves can impact the other and create a bit of an iterative loop. So with that in mind, he shared with us some of his efforts around creating a single model, particularly for the New York area, to help correlate local climate change and local climate with energy demand and that interface that impact on each other. Some of the variables you might expect he shared in terms of what he was incorporating in his model, the city topology, obviously the load as it changes is highly weather dependent when it comes to things like space conditioning, technology adoption itself, who's using what technology where, and then naturally data record availability. So the quality of that data, how do you know, how confident are you in that technology adoption and in some of the other data inputs you're using? So those are some of the key variables he talked about within the application of this model. He did several benchmarking historical case studies to help true up the model. He gave a particular example of, I think it was a heat wave in the summer of 2015. And then he talked about how he used the model to look forward in time and do some electrification scenarios and the mutual impact on the two environments as a result. He cited one example with if everyone were to switch to air source heat pumps in the greater New York area and the resulting additional 13 gigawatts of load that would be associated with that. So some of the key challenges he talked about within the model and within this effort is just trying to predict technology penetration rate, coming up with some sort of level of confidence or insight into what technologies are going to be adopted when and where is quite a thorny challenge, something we're very familiar with at EPRI as well. And then the customer behavior around those challenges. So not just knowing what technology, electric technology they're going to adopt, but then what they do around it. So what time are they going to get home? How are they, what temperature on the thermostat are they going to set? When are they going to change it? How are they charging their electric vehicle is a huge one, managed versus unmanaged charging. And then he talked about some of the next steps for his model, which is starting to look forward and incorporate carbon reduction and be able to add that sort of third leg to the bar stool, you might say, quantifying and predicting how these technology changes and adoption can affect emissions. From there, we had, as I mentioned, Brian Ergang, the other gentleman on the panel, and he shared a bit of his perspective from the LIPA point of view. He started off talking a bit about the evolution of customer data and technology. On the customer data side, he shared how it used to be that they were lucky if they had customer data at the level when someone going out and reading a meter once a month, maybe twice a month if they're lucky. And now they live in this world where they have advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, and they're able to see what a customer's energy usage is like at a 15-minute interval. So they went from very little information and data around customer behavior and utilization to some fairly granular information and data points that they can leverage. Similarly, he talked about technology evolution. He talked about how 20 years ago, electric vehicles, they were aware of them and they were where they were coming, but they were still kind of a small blip on their load forecasting plans. And he fast forwarded to today, and now he looks out 20 years in LIPA service territory, and they show electric vehicles being one-third of a one-third load increase of the total load for their service territory. Similarly, he drew a parallel with building electrification. It's a bit like where EVs were maybe 20 years ago. It's a bit small, but they're very aware that it's going to be growing as well. So twin challenges there around the predicting the adoption and utilization around those technologies. He went on and talked a bit about how they incentivize customer behavior, particularly with leveraging time of use rates. That's what the TOU there stands for. There's a significant opportunity within the energy system to mitigate some of our capacity challenges and also avoid really quite excessive grid build out if we're able to properly incentivize in a constructive way customer behavior instead of building out a grid to some extremely large number that we maybe reach once a year on a bad day. We can build it out to a number that we get much closer to on a regular basis, and so really better leverage all of the assets that are that make up the energy system. The last point he talked about was just estimating, trying to directly estimate climate impact, particularly summer peak demand, to trying to estimate how climate was impacting them directly, and in this case, summer peak demand. They were originally estimating roughly 1.5% to 2% per decade increase from climate. That's across the service territory. Now they're going through the process of downscaling and refining their methodologies and trying to get some numbers and insights at a more granular level, so it can inform where they really need to prioritize their grid infrastructure build out and prepare for tremendous growth. The last thought that he left us with, and it certainly resonated with me, I thought it was a good one. I put it at the bottom of the slide here. A forecast is an agreement that is a reasonable, I think my typo there, not his spoken typo, an agreement that is a reasonable projection of the future. And so he just sort of reminded, and you could see it a bit in his eyes, that there's a lot of consensus building, there's a lot of stakeholder input, and there's sort of, you do the best you can with the forecast, but at the end of the day, it's just a reasonable estimate, and you try to incorporate everyone's perspective to the best you can. So with that, I want to thank both those panelists and Andrea for moderating the panel, and I'll turn it over to you, Morgan.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. And really thank you to all of our READi teammates who provided overviews today. I hope you all enjoyed this whirlwind look at what we actually talked about. Certainly we cannot do all the talks justice in this little time frame, but hopefully it gives you a taste of what we discussed and at least a good initial insight into the types of conversations that we had there in the room. The last quick overview that I'll share is that we had Steve Hammer, who is the CEO of the New York Climate Exchange, who was our keynote presenter as well. The New York Climate Exchange is a brand new organization with incredible resourcing available to it, run out of Governor's Island, and they are really committed to bringing a wide variety of perspectives and insights together to answer some of the biggest questions and challenges as it relates to climate change. can only imagine why that was such an appropriate speaker and a really interesting keynote talk. And I think we are really interested to see in terms of what type of power system challenges that group might take on in the future in ways that we might all be able to collaborate as a part of that conversation as well. So it was a great way to open the day, and we really appreciate Steve being with us. Before I wrap us, I know Martin Schunan from BNL is able to join. So Martin, I wanted to invite you to share a few words about your experience and our time together. So Martin, do you want to make sure you've come off mute and and say hello to the group?
Yeah, I think I'm off mute.
You are.
Okay, good. Well, it was really a great experience because it's really important for a lab like BNL that is really so much focused on fundamental science to really connect with the more applied side of the world. I think that's really beneficial to both. You know, we might have insights that we really don't know map onto some of your problems because we typically don't spend much time thinking about your problems, right? So this was really a day where we got educated on some of the things that matter to you and this community. So that's very useful. Unfortunately, Mike Jensen couldn't be there, so I had to step up and learn something about clouds while I was preparing to give that talk. But I think it was really useful. I hope that you gained some things from the things that we presented. But really the you know, this sort of getting together these two sides or maybe multiple sides of the coin is really important. So I hope that we can kind of continue this kind of dialogue, because I think it's very useful for our scientists to know how their research can impact and how, you know, they may shape their research to be more impactful. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, Martin, thank you so much. It was great to hear. You're welcome to have you pitch hit for the cloud conversation, and really appreciate, like I said at the start of this webcast, you and your team, Elspeth, Dave, Pete, Mike, just everyone that put effort into planning this with us. We really appreciate it. It was a great experience for us. So thank you again. And I really want to say a broad thank you to the national labs as well. So Brookhaven was an absolutely great workshop, but it was one of 4. So to Argonne, to PNNL, to Oak Ridge, it's been a great experience to do this workshop series. The engagement with the labs has been more than just the workshops. We're doing case studies. Some of you may have seen the recent case study that was published with PNNL on hurricanes. It was featured in the New York Times and is a great example of collaborative work. We've also done some co-publications. So we have a READi insight on downscaling that was co-published with Argonne. So really great collaboration, and we're grateful for the national labs coming to the table in so many different ways. 2 other things that I want to say as we close out. So the first is resources. So as noted, this webcast is being recorded, so we will make this webcast as well as this slide deck available. And we are also still in the process of uploading the slides to our website from the workshop itself. So if you weren't able to join us, this gave you a sneak peek at some of the topics that were discussed, and now you really want to dig into the slides. You will have that opportunity. As soon as we get everything uploaded to the website, we will send an email out to today's webcast participants, to the workshop participants, and get you those direct links. The last thing I'll say is that while the workshop series is over, the work certainly isn't, and I really hope the collaboration just continues. So I encourage everyone that's on the line today to lean into the discussion, to reach out to the folks that you have met at these workshops. I'm certain that if you're on the line and you weren't able to be at this one, you probably so we, as I said in the beginning, are really committed to building this network, to building this community that wants to take on this challenge of resilience for the power system. And boy, have we been able to do that through this workshop series. So in terms of next steps, it's, for me, keep the conversation going, enable the collaboration as much as possible. So thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you to all of our speakers at the workshop. Thank you to the National Labs and to all of you for being with us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you at future workshops. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.